and welcome to part 1 out of 4 of Secrets of the New York City Subway, where we'll be going around stations and certain locations on the train that the average commuter may walk past but never stop to notice. This video will mainly focus on the borough of Queens, but first, here is a brief and quick history of the subway system. The transit system in New York City started with elevated trains, with the Manhattan Railway Company opening its first line in 1868, running from Day Street to 29th Street. It soon expanded quickly in Manhattan, and by the mid-80s, the map looked like this. Now, up until this point, there hadn't really been an official underground subway in the city yet. However, the idea was experimented with the Beach Pneumatic Transit System running from 1870 to 1873 under Broadway. Sadly, though, it was demolished, and its space is now taken up by the current system. It wasn't until 1904 when the IRT built the first official underground subway in Manhattan, starting from the old City Hall Loop and running up to 157th Street. It was during this period when elevated lines started to become unpopular, and many of the lines were being demolished with subways replacing them. There have been cases, though, when the elevated line was demolished, but without a subway counterpart for many years, such as the Second Avenue line. Now, the three most prominent subway companies during most of the 20th century were the IRT, the Interborough Rapid Transit, which is now today all the number trains, the BMT, the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, and the IND, the Independent Subway System. However, in 1940, the IND bought out the two other companies and amalgamated them into one transit system. Then in 1965, the Metropolitan Transport Authority was created and gave the lines a new color scheme. Now, to pay for a train ride, you would use tokens. However, in 1993, the MetroCard was introduced, which replaced them. And now we head into the 21st century, with the Hudson Line extension being opened in 2015 and Phase 1 of the Second Avenue line being opened in 2017. We finally have the subway map as it looks today. Before we head down to the platforms, there's something I want to mention. Now, I just said that MetroCards replaced tokens back in the 1990s. Well, now we have the Omni system, which is contactless payment. The control pads themselves are just attached to already existing MetroCard slots. But what's cool is that if you go to any subway turnstile that has an Omni screen, you can see the three generations of fare payment. The first being the tokens, which you can see here covered up. Then the MetroCard slot, and finally, the Omni system pad. So I'm starting my journey on the Queens Boulevard line, which initially opened in the 1930s. This section in Queens has a few secrets pertaining to its history. Take a Queens-bound train out of 63rd Drive, Regal Park, and look to your right, and you will see an opening that leads to nowhere. This is where an extension would have been, where tracks would have taken the trains to meet with the LIR's Rockaway Beach branch. As the branch started to decline in the 50s and 60s, the IND had wanted to seize the opportunity to use the branch for their subway line. However, it never went through, and all that's left is just a path that doesn't even contain tracks. This is not the only plan to connect the subway to the Rockaway Beach branch, as we'll see at our next stop. Now, Jackson Heights Roosevelt Avenue is a transfer station where you can go between the Queens Boulevard line and the Flushing line. But did you know that there's a whole other set of platforms to this? Yes, the IND originally was going to have an upper level. This was the other plan to connect the subway to the LIR, and the journeys would have started in the upper level. Now, I researched and found that the entrance to the platforms were blocked off, but they are somewhere along this exit I am showing you right now. Sadly, I couldn't find it. But if you take a train heading into the station, you can see the ramp leading up to the unfinished platforms. Now, of course, everyone knows that the M train wasn't originally on the Queens Boulevard line. It used to run south to Brooklyn. But there are also two more trains that used to run here, the G and the V train, the latter of which no longer exists. Now, prior to 2010, the G train ran on the Queens Boulevard line until it was cut back to Court Square Station. There aren't too many remnants that it once went here. However, if you go to a station along this line and look up at the train markers that are used to know the correct position of the train, you will see one that says R46 for the type of car, 4 for the number of cars, and G. The remnants of the V train are more difficult to find, but in this picture of the station entrance to 36th Street Station, you can clearly see where the V still is. Now, you may have noticed on the old map that I showed you that 21st Street Queensbridge was not connected to the Queens Boulevard line. That's because the station was originally the terminus, and instead it had tail tracks just beyond the station. And it was these tail tracks that were part of a plan to build a super express line that would bypass the entirety of the Queens Boulevard line and end up at Forest Hill Station. Next, I headed to Court Square, got on a 7 train, and went to Queensboro Plaza, which has a bi-level platform with one level going towards Queens or Manhattan. But actually, the station used to be 2 times as big with a whole other set of bi-level platforms. When the 2nd Avenue elevator came over from Manhattan, it shared a station with the Flushing line. This meant that Queensboro Plaza was a whole mess of tracks going in different directions. However, in 1964, the northern half was demolished, but there is still evidence of the old trackways today. Head up to the upper platform at the station, and you can see old infrastructure still there. And if you take any train heading out the station, you can also see where the tracks would have been that carried the 2nd Avenue line trains. You can only imagine how chaotic Queensboro Plaza would have been if the northern set of platforms still existed today. I hopped on the 7 train and went along the Flushing line. This was a line in which train cars were specifically decorated for the 1964 World's Fair. You can find these cars in the Transit Museum in Brooklyn. You can also find a Redbird car on the intersection of Queens Boulevard and 82nd Avenue. Now this isn't necessarily a secret, but at Metz Willets Point, there's a lesser used platform that's only used for tennis games, and on the southbound platform there's an unused portion of the platform with no advertisements. Anyways, we're headed back on the Queens Boulevard line as I headed east. Now I said before that the Flushing line specifically decorated trains for the 1964 World's Fair. Well, this wasn't the first time the subway did something special for an event like that. Back in 1939, New York held a World's Fair in which Walt Disney showcased various attractions, and to accommodate that, the IND built a spur from the Queens Boulevard line and it went through Jamaica Yard out onto the fair. However, after the fair was finished, so was the line itself, and it was demolished to make way for the Van Wyck Expressway. Now there's absolutely nothing left of the line today, but the line would have went somewhere along here and would have ended at the World's Fair station where this intersection is today. Now I've talked a lot in this video about abandoned platforms and tracks, but there are also disused entrances and exits to existing stations that are visible if you know where to find them. Take Kew Gardens Union Turnpike for example. The station is situated under Union Turnpike, but there isn't an entrance to the station from the Turnpike. Well, there actually used to be. Take a drive under Queens Boulevard, and on one side you can see a glass wall and a subway station behind it, and on the other side, the tunnel opens with a peculiar looking door towards the back. This was the entrance to Kew Gardens Union Turnpike, where cars could drop off people who would then head into the station. Unfortunately, the drop-off entrance got congested and it had to be abandoned. I switched onto the J train on Archer Avenue Station. This small section of Jamaica Line going underground was not actually part of the original route. The line used to stay elevated and go further at 121st Street, and had a few more stations ending at 168th Street. However, opposition from the people who had lived there caused it to be closed, and it was eventually demolished in the 1970s. If you look straight up on the intersection with 165th Street, you can see an old and disused station tower that sat next to the 168th Street station. Next, I found myself on an A train headed for the Rockaways. As you're leaving Rockaway Boulevard, you can see what looks like to be an abandoned railway that is all overgrown. So what is it? This used to be a branch line of the Long Island Railroad called the Rockaway Beach Branch. You may have heard me mention it earlier. Nearly all of the abandoned lines still exist today. This means that as you take an A train headed to Rockaways, you are actually riding on a space that used to belong to the LIRR. And along this stretch, there are 2 middle tracks that aren't used. These were the express tracks of the Rockaway Beach Branch. The next stop is Aqueduct Racetrack. Well, actually not, because there's only one platform for the northbound A trains, the only station to have this anomaly in the entire system. Actually, the next stop is North Conduit Avenue, and then Howard Beach Station. This station allows you to transfer to the air train to get to JFK Airport. But did you know that this station was actually the terminus of a relatively short-lived line called the JFK Express? Between 1978 and 1990, this express service ran from 57th Street, later 21st Street Queensbridge, to Howard Beach, where you could catch a bus to the airport. This was before the air train, which wouldn't open until 2003. Unfortunately for the JFK Express, low ridership meant that the MTA had to discontinue it. Now after the station begins the longest stretch between 2 subway stations. The span of track between Howard Beach and Broad Channel is approximately 3.5 miles. During the journey over the water, there are some pretty amazing views. Speaking of Broad Channel, did you know that's the least used station on the whole of the subway system? It clocked in at just over 90,000 passengers per year in 2019, and yet it's also the transfer point between the A and the Rockaway Shuttle if you're headed to the beach, which is where we're going. Also at Broad Channel, there's this huge blue door that actually used to be an entrance to the station, and if you peer through the door, you can still see the old steps, now overgrown. After splitting with the far Rockaway line, you may have noticed a single-tracked curve that connects the two diverging lines. This is called Hamill's Y, and is only used in non-revenue service. After getting off the terminus, Rockaway Park, which is not the same building as the one that served the Rockaway Beach branch, I headed to the beach for a quick break. After a 30-minute stroll, I went back up the line, transferred to Broadway Junction, and got on a Manhattan-bound L train to wrap it up. The L train mainly serves only two boroughs, Brooklyn and Manhattan, but it's actually the section between Halsey Street and Wilson Avenue in which a sliver of Queens touches the L train for a brief moment. So that was part 1 out of 4 of Secrets of the New York City Subway. Like and subscribe for part 2, which will cover the borough of Brooklyn.